I wonder how you all, if you could talk a little bit about how you all came to have your individual passions, your passions for individual freedom, and the concerns that we're really here to talk about today.
I'm lucky to have been here for a very long time. I won't say how long, because then you're going to look at me and go, really? But I've been here a long time and came up, started as a very enthusiastic volunteer, actually, and ended up working on individual cases of human rights violations. And then I got to work with President and Mrs. Carter. And I had lived overseas. I'd lived in Zaire, now the Congo, and understood how important it was what President Carter achieved with putting human rights at the front of foreign policy. So I think for today's conversation, I think what I'm feeling the urge to think about, to talk about, is to build on what the conversation was that they had, which was, where are we on our journey for human rights? Because civil rights, as we understand it, is very specific to participation, access to participation in civic life. And we have in recent years been looking at the rights of women, because not only that we have strong women and President Carter and Mrs. Carter feel strongly about it, but this is an area where human beings, half of the planet, are actually not full human beings in the way we live. Even in this country, we never were able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Women in this country do not enjoy the equal protection of law. And so when we have victims of violence, they are not protected by the law in the same way that men are.
I was able to see how the definition of human sometimes is actually the real root of the problem when you're talking about human rights. Whose rights are we protecting? And in cases, for example, like Thailand, oftentimes the people most often trafficked are young girls from hill tribes. They're not citizens, they don't have any paperwork, so they're not protected by the state, and they're not considered human. And I think you could apply that to pretty much every situation, whether it's refugees without paperwork or people living in poverty here in the United States or in Atlanta.
The necessity for any movement to advance, it had to resolve the internal contradictions. And to the extent that those internal contradictions were not resolved, then you would have a continuation of problems such that a particular kind of movement would not succeed in this effort. So let's expand on that and apply it to this national project that we see here in these United States of America. So there has been this discussion, a conversation in a sense, about freedom and human rights. But there needs to be, I think, a conversation about the conversation. All right, that gets to one of our internal contradictions, which is this capacity, and I think it came out in President Carter's comments early on in his interview, where we almost have this juxtaposition of being able to proclaim with pride the values, the exceptionalism that define, again, this American experience, right? And at the same time, refuse to grapple with the contradictions that defy those proclamations that we make about ourselves.
Getting people, one, to step out of their comfort zones, and whether it's taking a tour of different part of town or different neighboring state, let alone if you go overseas, do you really want to take time off the beach to go and visit an orphanage and see what the struggles are and how you can help? Because sometimes it's something as simple as $20 that a girl needs a birth certificate, just the paperwork processed, so that she can enroll in school. And that $20 that you would have spent in 2 or 3 days at Starbucks could go a long way towards allowing someone's whole entire life outlook to be different.
We started because of an injustice for a little girl who was 10 years old. We shared that rhetoric, much like they did in the civil rights era of the 60s, with everyone we could come into contact with in community, on our jobs. And then they rallied with us. And then there were hundreds of us speaking on behalf of that child who was once voiceless. And then we took that voice and we went to legislatures and we said laws must be changed. And it wasn't just 1, 2, 3, 4. There were thousands of us across this state of Georgia. And that moved us to work in concert with people we would normally not work in concert with. We worked in concert with men and Republicans and Democrats and independents and people who didn't think like us but knew that there was an injustice, and together we could do something that would change this state and the dignity of those children who were being bought and sold in our communities. And that materialized on May 5th, 2015, with the governor here signing the historic Safe Harbor Rachel's Law into act. That's a direct correlation back to the 60s and the civil rights movement. We just took a page book because we didn't have to reinvent that.
I wondered if you all could talk about social media and how this has impacted the work that you do. If it's facilitated it, if there are things in social media that make this work more difficult, what the net balance of it is.
Depending on, again, the concreteness, we have to make those decisions of the proper instruments based on the realities. And I'm not sure if we're having those conversations. Maybe it's our challenges in the kind of intergenerational transfer of technology, intergenerational transfer of movement, that we have that conversation. And maybe it's our fault or previous generations' fault for not having this dialogue with our young people and those who proclaim to use social media in the context of movement. Maybe they're just reaching out and grabbing what's there in the absence of that discussion.
Now, if you turn on the news, all you're really going to hear about is Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And if you're like me, sometimes you just want to put that on mute. And it's easier to go over to social media and see what else is happening in the world and what else is happening in our state that is not being covered because it's not getting as many ratings. And so it puts the news outlet in the power of people and activists and, you know, to your point, younger people, which Carter said there won't be any change without, so.
That's right.
FDR mastered the radio and got the public. JFK mastered the TV and got the public. And Donald Trump has mastered social media and is accelerating with using this. It was a really good point, I thought, because I think there's a caution that we can't dismiss it. We can't dismiss its power. We know that ISIS and Daesh and these groups are using it very effectively, so we can't be naive about it. We have to know it, we have to understand it and how to use it. I think we do have to understand, though, that the civil rights movement succeeded because they had a strategy. They had meetings, they had people meeting face to face.
What about this work makes you hopeful? If you're trying to appeal to people, say this is what you should do, what is it you see that gives you that hope that things can change and that the progress can be made?
I see it when we've rescued 13 boys and they said, thank you for rescuing us, even though we're not a girl, that you saw us. I see it when we'll go to the polls this November on November 8th, and we have the opportunity to vote for Senate Resolution 7, the funding mechanism, the constitutional amendment here in Georgia that will fund the services and the resources for children who have been victims of human sex trafficking. That's hope for me. It's hope for me when my baby girl says, I have a job, Ms. Williams, and no one is tricking me out anymore.
We have to have hope in the work that you're doing, and because it's almost like it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about, right? And there are this great work that you are doing and others to provide services to people who are trapped in what we can call slavery, right? And there are whole jurisdictions where they have adopted a comprehensive approach. In Sweden, they passed a law 15 years ago that sees people who are trapped in the sex trade, child or adult.
That's right.
And says, we know that this would not be a choice that any person would make if they had other options.
And I think the real way in which you can alleviate the pressure for organizations to pop up and save and recuperate and rehabilitate young girls and boys is for there to be other opportunities. And keeping kids in school is a huge piece of that, which is why all of the organizations always emphasize a component on staying in school education, helping girls finish at least K through 12.
Young people in Ferguson and other types of responses to some of the dynamics that we see unfolding in front of our eyes, I think they demonstrated a certain level of courage, which said that we are prepared to proclaim for ourselves that this is our movement and it's our time. And that's what I think gives me hope. Not that young people are moving, because again, to kind of complete the circle, young people are always moving, they're always responding in some kind of way to challenge what they see to be the distasteful or injustices of their time. But what I think I see happening now is that they're prepared to do so with a certain sense of courage, a certain sense of clarity.
Most people think they can't engage in human rights in their everyday lives. How can you guide us to be more involved in our thinking about thinking about and advocating for human rights?
Really think within yourself, what do you care about? Pick something that just really talks to your heart, and really dive in and go in for the long term. You know, try not to just dabble, dabble until you find the thing. But human rights needs us all because it's actually quite in danger.
I have learned that when I save one male, I generally, on average, save 3 to 4 girls. Because he will not go to try to profit off of her body.
Right.
When I can put him in school, in a classroom, give him a support system, the mentors that are necessary, counseling if that's required as well, housing, food, and a part-time or full-time job, then he doesn't see it as a necessary evil for him to go and prostitute another girl, or sell another woman.
There's a reason why all the great religions of the world have explicit reference to how one treats strangers. Because left to our own devices, we will hit the stranger over the head with the club. But we have to have these parables, and we have to have these surahs, and we have to have these religious edicts that tell us, don't hit the stranger over the head with the club, see the stranger as your brother and your sister. And hopefully after enough socialization to actually we begin to look at the world this way.